All right. So, a couple things before we get going. Hopefully, everybody had a good break. I put an announcement up on Canvas over the weekend. I had extended office hours yesterday. I saw a lot of you show up. I'll be in my office today. I get done teaching at 2. I'll hop right over there. I'm in Valentine, so I should be there pretty shortly after 2 to about 3:30. If you have any kind of questions you want to stop by and ask today, I'll be there then. I unfortunately will not be available tomorrow in my office. So if you have any questions tomorrow, I will try intermittently throughout the day to check my email and kind of get responses out. We've got a couple sitting in my inbox from last night that I'll get to today as well. But I won't be available in my office hours tomorrow. Okay. So if you want any last minute person, that's today from 2 to 3:30. Okay. Why might you want to get to office hours, or why might I put that announcement up over the weekend? Because what's Thursday? Our second in-class exam. So it's going to look very similar to the first one. I have this practice exam out there. It's got even more questions than what the exam will have. It'll look very similar to the first 25 questions. May or may not have one bonus question on there. Multiple choice. So I'm going to get here. I have an exam right before this, so I'll get them out, get you guys in. We can get started right at 9:35. Give you as much time as possible. My proctors help me hand out the exams, kind of alternating forms. Same procedure as last time. Okay. I've been getting some questions, and this is how I would kind of give a preamble before we jump into material here today. If I was studying for this exam, there are multiple sections of 251. Do you think studying other sections' questions are going to be more or less beneficial than studying this section's questions? Yeah, less if you look at I give you the materials that I'm giving you for a reason. You've got a practice exam. There's 30 plus questions on it. You can that's what I would kind of start out with. It's good to review notes. It's good to go back and review the text. I think probably reviewing the textbook is not an efficient, effective use of your time. There's stuff in it that you don't need to know. It goes more in depth than even I would expect you to know for some of the questions. I think working through more problems is what's going to be the most effective, efficient use of your time, which is why I gave you second practice exam, right? I would start with that. Make sure you have a pretty good understanding of all those questions. Take it without looking at the answers. No, I got these wrong. Try to figure out why you got the ones wrong that you did. Make sure you can reason through why the correct answer is what it is. If you're feeling comfortable with those, the next thing I would move on to are old quiz questions. You have a lot of resources available to you, maybe even other people when you're taking those quizzes. I can only do so much, right? So make sure you're going back and reviewing those quiz questions, right? Make sure you could answer those if they were on the exam. After that, then go back through what's another set of questions you have from every module. The ones that CL leaders do, all those old practice problems would be good ones to review. You still want more after that, right? I think across all those, there's 4 different modules, so it's like what? 48 plus 48 plus another 30. So you're somewhere around 130 questions there. It's a lot. If you get through those, and I guess you still want more. Well, we did a lot of in-class quiz questions together. Those would also be ones that would be good to go back through and make sure you could answer those without, having my help or having the assistance of your notes or whatever you have to find. Okay? So just working through more problems, that would be kind of how I would rank order things. And if you want to review your notes, there's probably some marginal benefit to that. I just don't expect that the marginal benefit or marginal utility of the time you put into reviewing your notes is going to be as high as the marginal benefit or marginal utility of reviewing more of these practice problems. Okay? Everything's economics, right? So that should, I think, logistically kind of cover the exam. Another thing, you'll need something to write with and a calculator that's not in your phone. I'll bring extra blank paper. You can write on the exams like last time if you want. Other than that, are any questions logistically for me before we jump into actual material here? Okay. Yeah. So what modules are on this exam? Well, close. I combined 5 and 6, but yes, 5 through module 9. So it's not cumulative in the sense, I'm not going to ask you module 3 questions, right? It is cumulative in that we're talking about inferior goods. We're talking about, right, all these things and concepts we talked about in the first exam, but no, I'm not going to go back and ask you, I wouldn't review problems that you would see from that first exam. It's just everything we've covered since the last exam. Yep. Any other content questions before we jump into it here. Okay. All right. So I've got the practice problems pulled up only because I said if I was rank ordering it, this would be the one that I would focus on first. So I'll kind of, if you have questions over old quizzes or practice problems, we can do those. Once again, I think these are probably the most beneficial use of our time in class today. I don't want to kind of pick and choose. You're here. I don't know exactly what you didn't understand what you did. So I'll kind of field questions and we'll kind of work through as many of these as we possibly can. Okay. So anybody have any questions that they want to see worked through? I guess I can pick and choose, but yeah. 25. All right. So yeah, this is a good one. This is definitely one that I was hoping someone asked. So we're given information here, and I'll kind of give you a slightly different type of question you might be able to see. This one might be even a little harder than what I asked you on the exam. So I told you there's two goods, caviar and ramen here. You have $100, you're spending your money on both of them. I essentially told you, anytime you're asked about substitution income effects, it's going to be the result of a price change. So the price of ramen here went down, decreased, right? I told you the total effect. I don't always do that, but here, why did I tell you? Because I told you initially you were buying 10 packets of ramen, 5 ounces of caviar. After the price change, you buy 12 packets of ramen, 4 ounces of caviar. So anytime I have these income substitution examples, I'm going to have two goods. Why does that? Okay. I'm going to have two goods. So we had kind of ramen here, caviar. We were told this was an inferior good. This was a normal good. And I saw the price of ramen went down. So instead of thinking about like actual values, like what the changes are, I'm much more likely, or you should focus on directional changes when it comes to these types of problems. So anytime you have an income substitution price change example, I'm just going to write out, anytime I have a price change, I know I'm going to have an income effect, a substitution effect, and kind of the sum of these two gives me my total effect. Now here we kind of could cheat a little bit because I told you after this price change, the amount of ramen you bought went from, no, I already forgot. Was it 10 to 12 packets? So the amount of ramen you bought went up. I was telling you the total effect. Caviar, you went from buying 5 to 4 ounces. So the amount you bought went down. So we know the total effect because I gave you those values. Now, we can break that down. Anytime you have a price change, you have two things that are going to occur simultaneously, the substitution and income effect. So what I would do is just write out, okay, I've got this good here. I've got this good over here. The substitution effect is always going to work the same way. I am going to substitute towards what is now relatively cheaper. And I'm going to substitute away or buy less of whatever is relatively more expensive. What is relatively cheaper here? The price of ramen went down. Is ramen relatively cheaper or more expensive? So I'm going to buy more of it in terms of the substitution effect, which means inherently I'm substituting away from the other good, caviar. So that substitution effect, it doesn't matter if they're normal, inferior goods, it always works the exact same way. Now, the one that works a little bit different is going to be our income effect. So this is where you can rote memorize things. I have a friend and their kid's trying to learn multiplication tables. And I was talking with them about like rote memorizing versus actually understanding what you're doing with multiplication. Rote memorization is only going to get you so far. If I then start to ask you about like 2.5 times something, well, now you're all the way thrown off. So I wouldn't try to memorize like, oh, the price goes up for a normal good. This is the income effects, vice versa. Let's think about why the income effect is working the way it is. When I see a price decrease, that's going to have an impact on our real income. So this is the idea. If I have $100 in my pocket, if prices now skyrocket, what happens to the value of that $100? Goes down, right? The value of currency, when we have inflation, goes down. Right? I can't buy as many things. If prices are lower, what's going to happen to my real income? It's going to go up. I can now buy more things with the same amount of money. So the income effect operates not through the actual income, but through our real income. Doesn't matter if I have $100 in my pocket. If everything costs $500, Can't buy anything, right? So if the real value of my income goes up, for a normal good, I'm going to buy more or less. If I have more income, for a normal good, I'm going to buy more. For an inferior good, if income goes up, I'm actually going to buy less. So this is an example where if I didn't give you the total effect, what would the total effect be here? We would say indeterminate. The income and substitution effect are working against each other. Now, so I would need to know something about the relative size of those effects. Now, because I know the total effect here, if the total effect is that I buy more ramen, which of these effects has to be larger? Yeah, whichever one is increasing it, right? Now, if I don't know the total effect, I can't say which is larger, right? I have no information to know which one. But if I know the total, I know which of these is going to be larger. It's the one that kind of dominates. Okay. Any questions on that one? So I'll give you a slightly different example because I can guarantee you'll see a question like this, right? Let's think about instead, and this one might be a little bit easier, but we can kind of work through the same things. Let's say the price of caviar goes up, right? I want to break this down, and it doesn't matter what order I do it in, into my income, my substitution effect, and then the total effect will be the sum of those two. So I've got ramen here, and I've got caviar. Right? So what's the easiest effect to always look at? It's always the same, doesn't matter what type of good, the substitution effect. If the price of caviar goes up, am I going to buy more or less caviar? Less, which inherently means I'm buying more of the other good. Just substituting away from whichever good is now relatively more expensive. So that's going to be one of my effects. But at the same time, I know if the prices of things are higher, what's going to happen to my real income? It's going to go down, which for a normal good, that means I'm going to buy less. An inferior good, I'm actually going to buy more. Mm-hmm. So here would be an example where I know the total effect. Why? Because they're both working in the same direction. So if I ever have an example where they're working in opposite directions, the total effect is going to be indeterminate. Here, it doesn't matter the size of these effects because they're both pushing quantity for both goods in the same direction. I know what the total effect would be there. Okay? So being able to decompose a price change into the different types of effects is definitely going to be a problem that you'll see on the exam. Okay? So whoever asked it, that was a good question. Any other questions on this one before we keep moving? Yeah. Where the price of ramen decreases? Yeah, we could work through one like that. So I'll go quickly. So if the price of ramen goes up, what's going to be my substitution effect? You guys should be screwing. This should be easy, right? The price of ramen goes up. What's the substitution effect? I buy less ramen and more caviar. Price is going up. What does that do to my real income? So for a normal good, I'm going to buy less. For an inferior good, I'm going to buy more. In fact, this might be a good question because I don't know the total effect here unless you tell me something about the relative size of these effects. They're pushing them in opposite directions. So let's say I told you that this ramen is a Giffen good. So a Giffen good was the idea that when prices go up, we actually see the total effect is that people buy more of that good. What's the only way it could be a Giffen good? What would have to be true about the income and substitution effect? It would have to be that the income effect is larger, right? So if the substitution effect is larger, I don't have a given good, right? Price and quantity are still working in opposite directions in terms of price and the total effect. If price and the total effect of a good work in the same direction, this is going to be when the income effect is larger than the substitution. This is the example that we said that could be representing a given good. Kind of counterintuitive to what we were talking about with demand, but that's because demand talks about specifically buying one good. Now we're thinking about we have the option to buy multiple goods. All right. So I would have to tell you more information. We don't know which of these is larger. Yep. Any other questions people had when to see work through? No other questions on that practice exam that you want to see work through? We're all going to get A's? Yeah. Well, so let's go back. We'll look at 12. We'll see if I have to switch over. I might just kind of tell you what it says. Okay. So here's one where we've got a positive consumption externality. So the only type of depictions I will give you on the exam for a negative and positive externality, you can model them two different ways. I'm only going to give you one, and this is the one that I kind of used when we were going through it. So a positive externality is an additional what? Cost or benefit? Benefit to society. So if I have a market, and this one was a positive externality, so yeah. If I've got a market, I've got my upward sloping, what's this curve? Upward sloping, so supply. Downward sloping is demand. Supply represents producers, marginal cost. Demand represents consumers, marginal benefits. Okay? So if I have a positive externality, that means that it's an additional benefit. So we're always going to model that, or at least the way that we'll do it for this class, is through what curve do you think I'll model it through if it's an additional benefit? The demand curve, right? Demand represents marginal benefits. So at every quantity, there is whatever the benefits to the people in the market are, plus some additional amount. So with a positive externality, the social benefits are going to be higher, right? In fact, how could I find the value of the positive externality? It's just going to be the difference between the marginal benefits of the people in the market and society's benefits, right? So this would kind of represent this vertical difference between the society's marginal benefit curve and then the private marginal benefits. That vertical difference is just the value of that positive externality. Okay. So on this one, if I ignore this for a second, where would the market have gotten to? Wherever supply is equal to demand. That's going to be the market equilibrium. Now, the market ignores these additional benefits. So this is where, don't get too lost in the graph sometimes. If I had a different question where I asked you, if we have positive externalities, do we get to, does the market over or underproduce? Well, if there's additional benefits that people aren't taking into consideration, do you think we get too much or too little? So why would you do something if it provides benefits to you? If there's benefits and you aren't aware that they exist, what might you do? Too much or too little? Too little, right? You're not factoring in if there's these additional benefits that you couldn't be enjoying. So when we have positive externalities, the market ignores these additional benefits. If they took them into consideration and made decisions using all the benefits that exist, the efficient point for society really should be a little bit higher. So the market here, we would say, is underproducing. Okay. So where would society want the equilibrium to be? At a higher quantity and a resulting kind of higher price there. So this is where if I ask you about prices kind of the society relative to the market, I'm always assuming that we're only modeling these positive externalities through the demand curve. Okay? If you look at the text or you Google it or something, you can model them through the supply curve. It gets a little bit trickier. Some topic that we didn't really dive into. I want to keep it a little more simple and less on your plate. All we're doing here is modeling our positive externalities through that demand curve. Now we can see that the market arrives at a price and a quantity that's too low.
I remember we did the flash. I also remember that there was like the positive technology consuming and producing.
So we can get this to pull back up for me here. There we go. It's always going to be through that demand curve. Yep.
Well, it's like the same change supply or demand.
I can model it through the supply curve, but I'm not trying to confuse you more than yeah. And I would get similar implications, but trying to keep it simple, I would just focus on doing it this way. Okay. Yes. All right. So I think that answers 12. Just something that might be worth mentioning. I think this is 13, but other problems you could kind of think about. So we're going to start to talk about things like surplus. So anytime I'm talking about surplus, the general definition would be it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. Now, those benefits and costs vary if I'm looking at producers, consumers, society, etc. But at its basic definition, it's just the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. So if I'm thinking about what is social surplus, that's the difference between society's marginal benefits and society's marginal costs. Just same format, just we're looking at society. So when the market stops here, it underproduces. For every unit in this range, well, if we don't have any negative externalities, the marginal costs or the private marginal cost, that's the same as our social costs, right? There's no negative externalities in this example. So here, for every unit in this range, the marginal benefits to society are greater than the marginal costs. So for every unit here, what would be true about the surplus for those units to society? They would all be positive. So every unit here, if the market would produce them, there is positive surplus that would exist for society. The problem is the market stopped here. So all of this surplus is lost, or this would be society's deadweight loss, right? So I get people like all the time trying to like memorize these graphs and things and thinking about like, oh, the triangle on top, to the right, to the left. Those are all ambiguous terms, right? What deadweight loss represents is a loss of surplus. Where is surplus here? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs for the person you're concerned with, which in this case, I was kind of talking about society here. Okay. Any other questions on this one? Yeah. Oh, any questions here before you? Yeah. Give me 1 second. So on this one, are there any more questions? Okay, so before we move on, I want to hit 13. I think this is also worth saying. What is the only thing that we talked about that can push the market to a higher quantity? Subsidies. The only tool we talked about that can increase quantity, which is what we want with a positive externality, is the use of subsidies, right? What would the perfect subsidy be? The value of that positive externality or that vertical difference between our marginal social benefit and the private market. So I know you asked a question, but you were probably about to ask a question on a different one. So we'll start with you. 8. Yeah. So I'll answer a couple more questions in answering 8, but I think it'll be beneficial, right? So 8's talking about who's bearing more of the burden of a tax. So we'll just talk about taxes for a second. Give you kind of a review of these, of taxes, and then eventually arrive to talking about how we identify who bears more of the burden. So I'm not going to draw it in here to have too many things going on in the graph. But if we have a tax, the market would kind of stop here. How would I identify consumer surplus? So once again, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to consumers. What represents consumers' marginal benefits? This should be an automatic response. What represents consumers' marginal benefits? The demand curve. What is the marginal cost to consumers? When you buy something, the cost is the price, right? So here we would have like consumer surplus up here. What would producer surplus be? Once again, it's the difference between the producer's marginal benefits and marginal costs. What represents the marginal benefit to producers? When you sell something, the benefit is the price. What's the marginal cost represented by? Supply. So here, producer surplus would be this large triangle down here. So let's think about what happens to producer and consumer surplus once we have a tax imposed. So a tax is an additional cost. So at every quantity, the cost will be whatever it was before, plus some additional amount. So this tax is essentially going to like shift our supply curve. So we said, after this tax, where is the new quantity going to be? Well, where does our new supply curve hit demand? It's going to be down here. Right? So here's where we can start to think about deadweight loss, producer consumer surplus, and eventually I will get to your question. So this is going to be the new price. However, this is the price that the consumer is going to pay for the good, right? So it's the amount of money that's handed over, okay? When you hand over $100, if the producer of that good has to pay a $20 tax, do they get to keep that a whole $100? No, what do they keep? They keep whatever you give them minus, well, what's the difference between these two curves? The value of the tax. So the price that the seller gets to keep is going to be something lower. So where is producer and consumer surplus now? Well, now it's going to be the difference between the price the seller keeps and the price that the consumer pays. So now my consumer surplus is only going to be this smaller triangle. Sorry, did I say producers? Consumer surplus is only going to be this smaller triangle up here. Producer surplus is now going to be this smaller triangle down here. What's happened with a tax to both producer and consumer surplus? They've both went down, right? Now, part of that loss of consumer and producer surplus still will be surplus, but who is it going to be surplus to? The government, right? So government revenue is going to be, well, what's the height of this rectangle? That'll be the value of the tax. What's the width? The quantity sold after the tax. That rectangle represents government tax revenue. So some of that tax revenue came from producers, some came from consumers. We also had fewer units after the tax, which the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost for every unit here. So all of this would represent surplus that was positive that we no longer see happen. So this would represent what? Deadweight loss. So how much of that loss of surplus to producers and consumers, which one is larger? The way I drew it, it looks pretty even, right? We can determine which one is going to be larger by simply comparing who is more inelastic. So I always use the example, I think in class, if we're both standing in front of a truck, there's like only one way to go, right? Whoever is more responsive and pushes the other person towards the truck to get out of the way, they're going to avoid the burden. So by being responsive, I avoid the burden. What is being responsive in terms of supply and demand, in terms of our price quantity? Being more elastic. So whoever is more elastic avoids the burden. Whoever is more inelastic or not responsive, they bear more of the burden. So all we're going to do there is compare our elasticity of demand to supply. Okay. Now, the elasticity of demand will always be negative. When prices go up, people buy less. So what we're really doing is comparing the absolute value. If, I think in this example, this was what, 0.9, negative 0.9 and 0.5. So both supply and demand, or both producers, consumers, are inelastic here. But who is more inelastic? Who is closer to zero? That would be our producers, right? So if producers are more inelastic, right, who is going to bear more of the burden? Whoever is more inelastic, okay? So all you're doing is basically comparing the absolute value of the elasticity. Whichever one is closer to zero, that person, I say person, that group is more inelastic, which means they're going to bear more of the burden of that tax. Or what does bearing the burden mean? They're going to lose more surplus, essentially. Now, you could also have a scenario where maybe the elasticity of demand was like negative 3.5 and the supply was, I don't know, 4.2. In which case, who is more inelastic now? Well, they're both elastic, but the person that's more inelastic would be consumers. So I keep saying person. The group would be consumers. So now we would have consumers that are going to bear more of the burden of the tax if that was the example. So maybe a roundabout way of answering this question, but right, this might be helpful for some other things that we're kind of thinking about. Yeah. 18. All right, so we're talking about indifference curves. So hopefully this one shouldn't be too bad. So I guess maybe this one is just more of a review of indifference curves. So when I have two goods and I'm thinking about I can buy different bundles of those two goods, we said an indifference curve represents some level of utility that I'm getting from that combination of the two goods. Okay. So what has to be true is we said that indifference curves that are further away from this 0, 0 point represent what? So if I have an indifference curve up here, the level of utility it would represent would have to be, yeah, higher, right? Now, that makes sense because even if I have the same amount of good X here and I have more of good Y, I would have to have a higher level of utility, right, or happiness. Now, why can those curves never cross? So let's say I had an indifference curve here and I said it was, I don't know, 60. Well, initially you might be like, oh yeah, that makes sense because if I have the same amount of good X, but more of good Y, I should have a higher level of utility. But if these curves cross, what would then be true over here? I've got the same amount of good X, but I have more of good Y. And now somehow my utility is lower. It doesn't make any sense, right? It kind of violates the idea of just what utility is. So we can never have these curves cross. So this blue line, we can't have these curves cross, right? They're going to be like these parallel kind of sloped curves, right? So which of the following is not true? Well, we already said they can't cross, so that one's true. The slope, we would say, of these indifference curves, we did call that our marginal rate of substitution. So what that represented, and this is, I'll kind of touch on here in just a second, is the ratio of the margin utility of good X to the margin utility of good Y. So this is where I think people can get confused, and I'll mention this with a budget constraint in a second. But what is on my X and Y axis here? Quantities. So when I'm finding the slope of this curve, if I had quantities, I could use the change in the quantity of Y over the change in the quantity of X. If all I have is information on the margin utilities, that's not what's on my X and Y axis. So when it comes to the margin utilities, it's not going to be Y over X. It's actually going to be the X good over the Y good. Okay? Now, it comes from a very similar reason, but I think it's easier to see with the budget constraint. And since we're talking about indifference curves, we're going to kind of all do this on the same one eventually. If I have two goods, right? If I'm buying only good X and we have income is M, how much of good X can I afford to buy? however many dollars I have divided by what? If I have $100, how do I figure out how much of something I can buy? It's price. What would I do? If I have $100, something is $10, how many can I afford to buy? What did I do in my head there? I divided my income over the price of that good, right? So we said these would represent the quantity I could buy. So if I'm using quantities, I'm still going to do the change in the quantity of Y over the change in the quantity of X to find the slope of that budget constraint, just like I could use quantities to find the slope of my indifference curves. However, if I don't have quantities and all I have are prices, well, notice if I do the change in the quantity of Y between these 2 points, that would actually be, right? This represented the change in the quantity of Y. Here's my change in the quantity of X. This would simplify to the price of the X good over the price of the Y good, similar to when we were thinking about the slope of our indifference curves. When we're talking about the slope of the indifference curve or the slope of the budget constraint, if we're using prices and or the margin utilities, it's going to be the X good over the Y good. The reason why, there's no nice included reason, it's simple mathematics. Okay? Okay? You know, just kind of go through it here. It's because what's on our X and Y axis, it's the quantities. If you're using quantities, then yes, it's just like every other kind of graph, right? It's the change in quantity of Y over the change in the quantity of X. To determine what those quantities are, we have different equations, which result in if I'm not using quantities, but I'm using prices or margin utilities, it ends up being the X good over the Y good. Okay. So just to answer 18, the slope is equal to the marginal rate of substitution. That one's true. Higher quantities of X on an indifference curve would lead to a steeper slope. So this is actually going to be where if I have more of a good, right, what's happening to the marginal utility of that good? It's going, so if I have more of good X, what's happening to the margin utility of the last unit I bought? Yeah, if I have more of something, the very first one had the highest amount of utility. By then the next one, okay, it's still high, maybe a little bit less, a little bit less. So that margin utility is going to be going down. So as I buy more of X, what's happening to the margin utility of X? It's going down. So what's happening to my marginal rate of substitution? The numerator is smaller, it's going down. So what's happening to the slope of my indifference curve? It's going down or it's getting flatter, right? So that would be not steeper, it's actually getting flatter. That's the one that's not going to be true, right? And then the definition of an indifference curve was A, I think on that one. All an indifference curve represents are the different combinations of these two goods that we would get the exact same level of utility from. Any questions on anything I said here? It was a kind of a roundabout way of answering 18. Once again, I'm trying to hit as many topics as I can given our time, okay? Any other questions you guys? Do you have a question before I didn't get to?
Yeah.
23. Yeah, this ties in nice to what we were just talking about. So let's combine these two things. And then I have one that I want to make sure we get to that I might skip questions and go to. So let's say I've got two goods. Now, this one, I didn't tell you what good is on the X and Y axis, and it doesn't really matter for this question. If it ever matters, I'll tell you which good goes on which axis. I'm not going to just expect you to kind of guess correctly. But here, just for the sake of this, let's put Den Pops here, hamburgers here. Okay. So this is my Y-axis good. This is my X-axis good. When we are spending optimally, we are going to be getting to the highest possible indifference curve given our budget constraint, which will result in there being one single point that we can't afford, that we've gotten to the highest level of possible utility, or the highest indifference curve we can get to. And at that point, the slope of our budget constraint will be the same as, or tangent to, the slope of our indifference curve. Okay. Now, what goods did I put my X and Y axis here? This would be what? The price of, what was X? Den Pop, price of hamburger is equal to the margin utility. And I'm going to ignore the negative signs here because they cancel just for the sake of kind of making it a little bit easier. So this should be true when I'm spending at that optimal point. If I rearrange this a little bit, what that's really saying is the margin utility per dollar I'm spending on both goods should be the same at that optimal point. When I've gotten to that highest indifference curve, given my budget constraint where the slopes are the same, if I just rearrange that, that's saying the margin utility I'm getting per dollar I'm spending on both goods is the same. Now, if that's ever not true, right? So in this example, let's kind of, what were the actual margin utilities? So the margin utility of the last dem pop was what? 10. The price was $1. So this was my den pops here. And then hamburgers was 15 over 2. So this is what? 10. This was 7.5. These are not equal. In fact, one of the goods has a higher margin utility per dollar. It doesn't have a higher margin utility. The margin utility is actually lower, but the margin utility per dollar I'm spending is higher for that good. So what am I going to want to do? I'm not at this point, right? These were not equal. So I'm going to want to actually buy more of which good? Whatever has the higher amount of additional utility or higher amount of margin utility per dollar I'm spending, all right? So I would actually buy more den pops here, fewer hamburgers. Now, as I do that, what's going to happen? So if I buy more den pops, what's happening to the margin utility of the last one I bought? It's going down. As I buy fewer hamburgers, what's happening to the margin utility of the last one I bought? It's actually going to be higher. So that's going to occur. I'll kind of change my consumption habits until I get back to the point where those two things are equal again. Any questions on that one before we keep moving here? Okay with this? Okay enough? Okay. All right. So one that I do want to make sure we had some time to kind of work through, because I know that you'll see one similar to it on the exam, is giving you a table where there's a lot of things missing, right? We'll see if I can fit this all into one here. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got my total variable cost, total fixed cost, total costs. I've got 0, 10, 700. Got my average variable cost. Got my average fixed, average total, marginal cost. And I've got 750 here. I've got 15 here, and I've got 200 here. So if I give you a table like this, we've got a bunch of missing information, right? I then start to ask you questions about this. So I think the first one, which is kind of easy, and I had on there, it's going to make a point, but also it's usually going to be helpful in solving this to answer a lot of the other missing points. So the problems that you're asked, you don't have to fill out the entire table. I'm going to try to help you fill out the entire table here. I think it'll be a good exercise. Okay. So what are my total fixed costs? I don't have them anywhere, but what do I know they have to be? Well, if I'm producing nothing, my variable cost should be nothing, right? So what are the only type of costs I have when I'm producing nothing? Things that I'm locked into, no matter what my production decision is. My lease. If I choose not to stay open, I still have to pay that agreement I legally was, bound to. So what is my total fixed cost here at 0? All of my costs are fixed, right? Now, what's my total fixed cost at a quantity of 4? 700, right? my total fixed costs do not depend on how much I'm producing. They are the same if I shut down or I produce a certain amount. So I can fill out that total fixed column right away. That's going to help me in filling in a lot of the rest of this. Now, I don't have to for a lot of, I think, the questions I asked you here, but what other column can I now automatically fill in very quickly? If I know my total fixed costs, anytime I'm looking for an average, so if I want an average fixed, variable, or total cost, all that's going to be is whatever that, well, here we go. Whatever that cost is divided by quantity. You know, technically I could write this out as 3 equations. I'm just saying any average is just that total cost of, you know, whatever the cost is over quantity. So if I know my total, if I want my average fixed costs, my total fixed costs over quantity should give that to me. So I'm just going to do what? Well, I can't do really averages when I have a quantity of 0. That doesn't make any sense. But a quantity of 1, my average fixed cost would be 700 over 1. At 2, 700 over 2. 700 over 3. So it's going to be what? 23 on. Let me make sure I'm doing math. 23.33 repeated, right? And then 700 over 4 should give me what? 21.75. I'm doing math in my head, correct? No. 21.5. 700 divided by 4. So I'd be what? Why am I struggling with math? This is not right at all. This is going to be, why am I blanking? 17.5? Or sorry, 175. Yeah, I'm looking at this wrong. So I've got my average column filled out pretty quick. Okay. Now from here, I can do a variety of different things. There's really no, like, I would start with your fixed cost always in these examples. From here, it's probably going to be specific to like what I'm asking you for. So I think in this specific problem, I asked you for what the, was it total costs of the 4th unit? So what are going to be the total costs of the 4th unit here? Well, if I know my average total costs, right? So average total cost would be my total cost over quantity. So my average total cost is 200 at a quantity of 4. Just a little bit of algebra. My total costs are going to be 4 times 200 or 800, right? So I can fill that in. Now, what if I asked you for what your total variable costs are? Well, I don't have the average variable cost, but what is total variable cost? My total cost is just going to be the sum of, I only have 2 types of costs, variable and fixed. So if I knew the total costs, I know my fixed costs. What do my variable costs have to be? 100, right? If I know that my total costs are just the sum of these 2 different costs, 700 plus what would get me 800? 100. Okay. Getting some confused. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Fixed cost.
Mm-hmm.
Is total fixed cost only the same? But-
No, in fact, what would total fixed cost be in the long run? 0. Total fixed costs are always going to be the same value when I'm in the short run, when I'm looking at different production levels. Doesn't matter how much I'm producing, it's always going to be the same value. No. What are the costs in the long run? We just said it. So in the long run, my fixed costs will always be 0. In the short run, my fixed cost will be something above 0, but it'll be the same value no matter how much I'm producing. Yep. Okay. Now, let's say I didn't give you any of this information. How could I find the average variable costs here? Yeah, so if my total costs are the sum of my variable and fixed costs, my average total are also the sum of my average variable and my average fixed. So if I were to kind of look at this, okay, I've got 200, 175, And then this would have to be what? 25, right? I could kind of fill in the average variable cost as well there, even if I didn't have this information over here. Now, if I have this information, how could I also find average variable cost? Take my total and just divide it by quantity. Hopefully I get the same value, 25. Okay. Any other questions here before we keep going? Okay. So I think the next question I asked you for what the marginal cost was for that second unit. So when I'm thinking about marginal costs, marginal anything. So this is marginal product of labor, marginal benefits, marginal cost. Marginal is going to be the change in the total. So the change in my total cost divided by, well, what's changing, how much I'm producing. Okay. So I need to figure out what is the total cost when I'm producing 2 units, the change from the total cost when I was producing 1. And now here's where on the exam, maybe I wouldn't give you quantity jumps of 1. I think on the practice problems, I give you an example where the jumps are 10. Here, it's a little bit easier because, well, what was the change in my quantity? Just going from 1 to 2, so 1. Now, if I had given you like quantities of 10 here, well, then the change in quantity would have been 10. Or if it would have been change in 5, it would have been 5. But here, 2 minus 1, right? Or quantity of 2 minus the quantity of 1. All we're really looking for is the difference in our total costs. Well, I know the total cost at 2 is 750. What's the total cost at a quantity of 1? Well, if I know my variable costs and my fixed costs, how do I get my total? I just add those together. So I've got 710. So my marginal cost here would be 40. Okay. And then I would kind of do similar things to fill out kind of the rest of this table. So I think I've given you enough tools where we've used every single type of equation. You could fill in the rest of these. For the sake of time and getting through some more problems, I'll kind of probably move on. But, you can imagine, okay, how do I get the total variable cost? I know these two, I can back this out. I can kind of work backwards from averages to fill in totals. If I know totals, I can find averages quickly. So right here, if my total variable cost is 10 at a quantity of 1, my average variable cost would just be 10 over 1, right? I can kind of work through these relatively, not going to ask you to fill out a whole table on the exam, but I could ask you about any one of these points, okay? Any questions on this or any other cell here that you might not be completely sure how you would find? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so how would I find the total cost here? Well, this one, I don't know my average total, but how could I find my average total? It would be the average variable plus my average fixed. So I'd be at what? 38.33 repeated. No, am I looking at this right? Yeah. Or sorry, that's 200. These decimals are really screwing me. Yeah, so this would be sorry. I didn't leave myself enough room now, but 248.33 repeated. I would then take that, multiply it by 3. That's going to give me what? Something a little bit less than 750, right? Did I do math wrong here? So 248.33 repeated, multiplied by 3. I should get like what? 745, right? So then I would kind of have a negative mark. So that's, they didn't ask you to fill out the whole table, which is why that's kind of a goofy one where I have like a negative marginal cost. There's more so I can kind of have the other values work out to be a little cleaner. If I was to ask about that one, I probably wouldn't give you these like repeated decimals that you have to use just because it, if you put in your calculator and you round it, now it's a little bit off. But yeah, that's how you would find it. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving on? Any other questions people want to see worked on? Yeah. Speak a little louder. 31. So 31. Okay. So this would be a good one to know what a firm's cost structure looks like. And we'll kind of hit some concepts here. So I just gave you values in this problem. So I'm going to give you a visual that would help you answer this type of a problem. Okay. So I'm giving you information on marginal costs and the average variable costs. So if I'm thinking about production decisions of a firm, we know our marginal cost curve should look kind of like this little Nike swoosh symbol, right? Where initially it's decreasing because why? If my marginal costs are going down as I produce more, I must be experiencing gains from, specialization, right? Now, as I want to produce more and more, I'm hiring less and less effective workers. So eventually, even though they're specializing, I'm getting really crappy workers. So eventually, I started writing without, right? I've got kind of diminishing, returns takes over, and my marginal costs start increasing. Now, one thing that we said is going to be true is that the relationship of my marginal cost to my average total costs, right, is going to be that my marginal cost curve hits the average total cost at its minimum point. We can kind of intuitively think through this as to why. When I'm talking about an average, if you have an average score or grade in the class right now, like let's say you have an 80. If you get a 70 on the exam, what's going to happen to your new grade? It's going to be lower. Right? That's how averages work. You're adding in a lower number than what the old average was. It's going to pull your average down. So anytime the marginal cost is below the average, what's happening to my new average as I produce more and more? My average is going down. As soon as my marginal cost is above the old average, what's happening to my new average? Well, now it's going to start pulling my new average up. Right? So in terms of your grade, you want to be over here, right? You want that marginal cost to be above the average, right? So we know this is going to be true. This is just how we calculate average. This would have to be true, right? So in this problem, I think I told you at the quantity of 10, the average variable cost is 20 and the marginal cost is 18. So you know that you're at a point over here. Oh, this is quantity of 10. Marginal cost is 18. Average, and I did variable, not total, sorry. The same thing would be true about our average variable cost. This problem asks about average variable. So if the marginal cost is below the old average, when I increase to that 11th unit, what's going to be happening to my average variable costs? They're going to be a little bit lower, right? So average variable cost must be less than 20, okay? Does that answer? I forget who asked that one now, but yeah. Now, what if I wanted to put my average, so this is my average variable cost. What if I wanted to put my average total cost curve in here as well? What's going to end up being true is marginal cost hits that average total cost curve at its minimum point as well, okay? So what's happening to the difference between my average total and average variable cost? The way I drew it, it looks like it's going down, but why, right? Well, what is our average total cost? It's our average variable plus our average fixed. If I think about my average fixed costs, if my total fixed costs never changed, if I produce more, as I produce more, what's happening to my average fixed costs? Well, my total fixed costs stay the same. So my average fixed cost, if the denominator is larger, must be going down. So if my average fixed costs are going down, what's happening to the difference between my average total and average variable? It's going down as well, right? They're becoming closer and closer to each other, okay? So if I was thinking about the same example and I didn't give you a number, so this was the average variable cost was 20. First of all, if I'm in the short run, what do I know at that 10th unit? My average total cost has to be greater than what value? So if I'm in the short run, I know that my fixed costs have to be above 0. So if my average variable cost is 20, in the short run, my average total cost must be larger than that, right? Something greater. So I could come up with a hypothetical value, but it's going to be something above 20. So what's going to be true? My marginal cost is going to be, well, if it's less than my average variable cost, it's definitely going to be less than my average total. So if I produce more here when the marginal cost is 18, what's going to be true about my new average total cost? It's going to be decreasing, right? I couldn't say exactly what value it is without giving you, a hypothetical value, but I know that it's going to be decreasing, right? Because if my average variable costs are decreasing, I have to be on that portion where my average total are decreasing. And that's because if marginal cost is below average variable, it has to be below average total, right? Any questions over this one before we keep moving here? Are we out of time? Okay. Any other problems people wanted to make sure they saw work through here? No? So no one's going to show up to my office this afternoon? Got all our questions answered? Yeah. 7? All right. So I alluded to this earlier, but if we had an example where we had a tax, right? And I want to figure out what's the new price that the consumer pays and what is tax revenue, right? So this is where I'll also kind of some test taking strategies. If I give you like these 2-part questions, sometimes like it's helpful to like rule answers out. If you're like really confident on one of them, at least you then have a 50-50 chance. So why do I give you multiple choice exams? It's not because they're easier to write by any means. Short answer exams are a lot easier to write and kind of like giving me an actual value, and then I can just grade whether or not you get the value right or wrong. If you have like multiple choice, if you know some of the concepts, a lot of times you can at least narrow it down to where you have like a 50-50 guess, whereas on a short answer, you might like be completely lost, right? So here, I'm looking at this graph. What is going to be the new price that consumers pay after the tax? The new equilibrium price would be at 80. So that's the price that consumers are going to pay. So right away, we're looking at this. The price the consumer pays is going to be 80. If it helps, in all the examples I'm going to use, I'm going to give you a tax on these producers. So the price the consumer pays will always be above the price that the seller gets to keep. I'm going to hand over $100. They have to pay X number of dollars of tax, so they get to keep less of that. So in this example, the new price after the tax will represent the price the consumer pays. What is the price the seller gets to keep? It's going to be that amount minus the tax. What's the value of the tax here? Now look at this quantity. What's the difference between the supply curve and the supply curve of the tax? 40. Right? 40 and 80. The difference there is 40. So I've got this new price the consumer pays is 80. The price the seller keeps is 40. Now, what if I'd asked you for, instead of tax revenue, just for the sake of this example, how would I find producer's surplus? So producer's surplus, anytime we're calculating surplus, the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to producers now. What's the marginal benefit to producers? The price, which is for them now 40. What's their marginal cost? That's represented by my supply curve. So the difference between the price that they keep and their supply curve would be this little triangle down here. So what? The difference between these two. So 30 times 60 times a half. Okay. Now, it's not what I asked you about. I asked you about tax revenue. What would represent tax revenue here? Well, that's going to be this big rectangle in the middle. That's a very non-technical way of saying it. Why is it the big rectangle in the middle? Because that's the quantity sold after the tax, 60, times, or what would the height of that rectangle be? The value of the tax. So 40 times 60 would give me that value of 2,400. Now, I don't multiply by half because it's not a triangle, right? It's a rectangle. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, we'll go there 1 second. Any other questions on this one before we jump ahead? Let me make sure there's nothing else I want to say here. Just for the sake of mentioning this, because we haven't yet, and we won't have time to work through an example. What we talked about earlier, subsidies are a solution when we have positive externalities. What would a tax be a solution to? If taxes reduce quantity, when do I want to reduce the quantity of something? When there is a negative externality. So taxes would kind of help us solve the negative externality issue. Now, what also helped us reduce quantity? Not just taxes. We could use quotas. We could also use price ceilings and price floors. All of them could push us down to this lower quantity. So we had a lot of solutions with negative externalities, only one solution with that positive externality. So if I ask you about a positive externality and how the government can solve it, the only answer should be subsidies. If you get that wrong on the exam, I'd be really disappointed, okay? So 33. So we talked about these right before break. We have two measures of market concentration. So I might ask you to calculate both. I might also ask you about values at the extreme, which still involve the calculation, okay? So if I want to find the 4-firm concentration ratio, and I gave you something like this, I already gave you the market shares in terms of percentages. How would I find the 4-firm concentration ratio? I take the top 4 firms and I add up their market share. It's as easy as that. If I gave you a question like this, it should be easy points, hopefully, on the exam, right? So 46 plus 32 plus 10 plus 8. So I don't take the first 4 listed. I take the top 4 market shares, right? So 8 plus 10 plus 32 plus 46 will give me that 96%. Okay? That one shouldn't be too bad. What would the 4-firm concentration ratio be of a monopoly? There's only one firm. What's their market share? 100%. So the 4-firm concentration ratio would be 100, right? What if I had 2 firms evenly splitting the market? My 4-firm concentration ratio would be 100%, right? I don't take the top 4 firms. There's only 2. When I add them up, it'd still be 100. So it's a good measure, but it doesn't really allow us to like differentiate between those markets that are like heavily concentrated with 1, 2, 3, or 4 firms. They would all have, as long as the number of firms is below 4 below, our 4-firm concentration ratio is 100%, right? So what's a better measure is going to be this HHI, right? So this Herfindahl-Hirschman index allows us to differentiate at the top when we have really heavily concentrated markets. So all we're going to do with that HHI is take every firm's market share as a percent and kind of square them and then add them all together. So I'm never going to give you an example where I give you like 20 because this is time on the exam. I'll probably give you 5, 6 firms, maybe 4 if I'm, feeling nice. So all I would do here is go through and say, okay, what was the market share of the first firm? 46 squared. Second firm, 32 squared, 4 squared, 10 squared, 8 squared. Add them all up. I think if you do that, I think you get the 3,320. Now, I think the difference there, the reason why I knew that is because one of the wrong answers was if you only took the top 4 firms. With the HHI, you add up the squared market share, not of the top 4 firms, of every firm. 4-firm concentration ratio, it's in the title. You use the top 4 firms. For the HHI, doesn't say anything about 4 firms. You use every firm. Okay? Any questions? Does that answer the question that someone had in that one? Forget who it was now. Okay. Now, I could also ask you, instead of just calculating, maybe a more conceptual, what would the HHI of a monopoly be? Well, there's only one firm. The market share would be 100. So 100 squared would be 10,000. Now, what would the market share be if I had 2 firms evenly splitting that market? 50 squared plus 50 squared. So what? 5,000. So notice I can differentiate with the HHI between these heavily concentrated markets. I couldn't do that with a 4-firm concentration ratio because it would have been 100 for both of them. Now, if I could get a perfectly competitive market, Now, nothing's ever truly perfectly competitive, but what does this HHI start getting closer and closer to? Yeah, 0, right? Think about if I had like 1,000 different firms, each one would have like a market share of 0.1 squared, add up 1,000 times. Still going to be a really small number, right? Now, it'll never truly be 0, but it's going to be getting closer and closer to that value. Right? So the higher the HHI, the kind of more concentrated the market is, or more of the market share is going to be falling with one firm. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, just got a couple minutes left. Any other questions people had quickly? Yeah.
The budget restriction, I've seen by Excel solve the budget and like when we use the budget.
Hmm. So what do you mean? Just define what? So in terms of the budget equation, what I would kind of know, right, is what I did earlier, which was if you've got these two goods that you're buying, that budget equation is going to tell you that if I'm only buying good X, here's how much I can afford. If I'm only buying good Y, here's how much I can afford. And the slope will be the price of that X good over the price of the Y good. Yep. That's what I would kind of focus on with that budget equation. Yep. Nope, that's just where we started out. And then when we rearranged it, we can get this visual. Yep. All right, we got a couple more minutes. Like I said, I'm not going to be around tomorrow, so I want to make sure. Are there any other questions about the exam logistically before I let you guys get out of here? All right, so try to get here a little early. I'll try to get the previous section out so we can get going so you have the full time. Other than that, good luck studying. I will see you guys on Thursday.